Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. The 70s were a decade unlike any other. Hippie culture had already been swallowed and then regurgitated by the mainstream, and in order to maintain forward movement, it had to mutate into something else. The subculture of those who grew up throughout the 60s morphed into many different things. An interest in alternative religions, philosophies, and in the occult began to burgeon, and the drug culture became more sophisticated. Within this contextual milieu came forth three men who would become countercultural icons for different reasons, all somehow transformed by an epiphanal event. Terence McKenna would be delving into experiences that would lead him to become an orator for psilocybin after he and his brother would confront the abyss in La Chorrera. Robert Anton Wilson would pen the Illuminatus trilogy that would lay the ground for a whole subculture of conspiracy theorists after a series of telepathic transmissions from extraterrestrials from the Sirius star system. And Philip K. Dick would write his exegesis after an ecstatic religious experience was triggered by a necklace worn by a woman who was delivering pharmaceuticals to his door. Although we mainly touch on Terence in this conversation, today's guest, Erik Davis, and I also talk about the cultural context that all of this sprang from. I start off the conversation by asking Erik, what was it about the drug culture and the spiritual exploration of the early 70s that inspired him to write High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 70s?
I think the ultimate answer for that is really personal. It's interesting. I've been reflecting lately on how many of my interests are really a kind of covert way of exploring my own life, even though I don't necessarily write about my own experience that much as a journalist or as a scholar. I grew up in, the early 70s was the first world that I knew. I was born in 1967. And when I recall the emotions and the feelings, and I grew up in a fairly, countercultural or post-countercultural environment. My parents weren't countercultural, but there was a university town in Southern California, a beach town. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of in the air, and definitely influenced my whole life. And I was always tuned into that material, even when I was young in the 80s, when I could have been a punk rocker or a new waver. I was sort of a hippie kid and a stoner. I listened to new music too, but I was definitely tuned into that domain and that frequency. And that just stayed with me all along. And somewhere along the way, rather than the 1960s, which is the kind of era that most people focus on, even though I was interested in that and the music and the politics, I found that I was actually more at home in the 70s, whether it was listening to Yes and looking at the Roger Dean covers or Heavy Metal magazine or things got more dark and weird and like not as utopian in a lot of ways, which maybe made more sense to me as a young man. I'm not really sure. And then later on in college, and this is kind of an interesting point I don't think I've talked about. So this was, I was college in the mid 80s, and I was friends with a bunch of really smart, really funny people who did a good job of playing the high-low. And the high-low is something that I believe is, exists in different generations, but is particularly important to Gen X. And it's certainly to the kind of university world that we had. which is that there's a tension and a balance between high art and low art, and that both are cool, and that part of what's fun is to actually kind of mix them or set them in tension with one another. So you like bring up the low art into some highbrow, some intellectual thing, and then you kind of enjoy the high art as if it was just entertainment. And there's like, you're playing with that. And I think it was really something specific to that era in a way, although, people still do it. For example, I still write for an online zine or online magazine called High Lowbrow. And, that the guy who runs it was my generation, and we went back to the 90s writing essays together and things like that. And, in a way, that's a lot of what my project is. I'll get back to the 70s in a moment, but it's how to bring real, scholarship, intellectual history, problems in interpretation, problems in the meaning of experience, a lot of the kind of gnarly, overly complex questions that scholars learn to ask, and then look directly at things that are usually not taken seriously, that are marginalized, are seen as absurd or silly or not worth paying much attention to, or merely bizarre, kind of the way that people used to treat popular culture. But in my era, in the 1980s, that was one thing that happened in scholarship, as people started to take popular culture even more seriously than they did before. So you'd have people writing dissertations on Madonna, or, even pop figures started to seem really significant. And that says a lot about that era. And it just happened with some of the people I was riffing with these ideas with back in college were just really into the 70s. And they were kind of like they initiated me into the act of seeing the 70s as a separate era than the 60s, of not just saying, oh, it's the counterculture. It's like, no, there's something specific that happens in the 70s with fashion, with film, with music, with sensibility, with spirituality, with drugs, with technology. And so that kind of planted that seed. And I always remained interested in the culture, music in particular, but also the kind of like backwash of the counterculture, and how those things really influenced me. Like I mentioned, growing up in that era, we as little kids were being influenced by popular culture that was produced sometimes quite explicitly by druggies or people who are influenced by the drug culture. Yes. So HR Puffin stuff is a great example.
I was just thinking that.
We're just kids. They're like, oh, big, big monsters and, cool things. And you're like, whoa, that thing is so trippy. And the other example I have is like, there was, I used to read Eerie magazine. So this is probably like 1976, around then, mid 70s. And I liked horror, and I really liked Eerie magazine. And there was one particular one that I could never get out of my mind. And it's a Richard Corbin one where this kid goes to play pinball at, just like a corner store or drugstore. And the kindly owner of the drugstore keeps getting hit up by the mob, who are, they want protection money. And finally he says no, and the mobster kills him. And so then you see this little kid, who's otherwise seems kind of innocent, like get a book of like magical spells, and he sits there and he like draws a pentagram on the ground, and he like invokes a demon, and then the demon grabs the mafia guy and he puts him into this like cosmic, hellish pinball game where like the planets are the little features, and he's just bouncing around in he's damned to this eternal pinball game. And it just totally blew my mind. And there was something about in retrospect, the combination of like too much detail on like black magic or weirdness, pop culture, pinball, a little kid who's otherwise innocent. That's the thing about the strip. It's not like he's knowing. He just grabs the magic book. Uh-huh. And that really captured something about the way that, for me, popular culture, when I first encountered it, had this real, weird, sacred, mystical, occult charge to it partly because it was the 70s. And it was funny, much later, I there's a friend I have named Peter Berbergal who wrote a book about magic and rock and roll, and he's kind of interested in the 70s too. And he also obsessed about that very same comic book. I mean, that very same comic strip. So there's something about that as a kind of touchstone. Anyway, all this stuff is kind of swirling around. I always kind of was interested in it. And not to go on too long, just that when I decided to go and get a PhD, I was going to write on Philip K. Dick alone, just to write about Dick's experience. So of course I had to put it in the 70s because that was what was going on. And then at the last minute, I decided to not do that and to do the broader project, which turned into High Weirdness. And as soon as I made that move, and I don't want to just talk about Dick in isolation. I want to compare him to other people who are having other experiences. It was important that they were close in time. And of course, they also share certain characteristics because they were at that time. And so then I realized that I had a golden opportunity to really try to map that period of time as well as tell these individual stories. Indeed, that was part of my job. So in a way, the book is kind of like it's like 3 books that are kind of layered on top of each other. And one is really just a meditation on the 70s, which I think is still remains really important for us today, because in a way it's more like today than any other time in American history.
And in all 3 of those people's lives, there was some sort of landmark event that really changed things for them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that was another layer of the book, is really what happens in these people's lives, these outlandish, exploratory, experimental, people who are taking drugs or practicing magic or, pursuing the edges of their own minds, science fiction imaginations. What happens when minds like that are already kind of open, radically open, have these experiences that are just so profound or so psychotic that they can't help but transform the rest of their lives? They can't let them go. They have to figure out some way of integrating them or narrating them or putting them in touch with the rest of what they do. And so that question of what are these experiences? How do we think about them? Are they religious experiences? Are they psychotic breaks? Are they insights into cultural forces that we normally don't see? Is it a mixture of all of those? But whatever they are, what happens when people have them? And then there you are, waking up the next day, you're feeling a little more normal, and you're like, what was that? And sometimes that next day takes a long time to come, or it never really comes. In some ways, Philip K. Dick never left the ambiance of these wild experiences he had in 1974. He got more grounded at points, but then he would return and see a new meaning to them, and still kind of stay in conversation with that enigma. And I think McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson both had different ways of kind of both moving on and staying in touch with the experiences they had. And in a way, that was kind of what was interesting to me, is what happens when people have more or less religious experiences, but don't turn them into religion, but don't just write them off as like, oh, I had a psychotic break or something weird happened. I don't think about that anymore. Where you try to still make meaning of what happened to you, but you can't like resolve it into, oh, I had a religious experience, or I saw the truth about reality, or now I know, now I'm a master, now I'm a guru, who kind of can't do either of those and sort of stay in this somewhat uncomfortable in between, where you're partly a guru or a seer and partly a sardonic communicator, partly a countercultural intellectual, which is already a very weird thing to be. I can say from personal experience. So, these guys were just fascinating stories, and no one's really dealt with them the way that I had, at least in a kind of scholarly way.
Yeah, I think you did a fantastic job with that. What do you think it was about the context of the early 70s that made it such a vital part of that alchemical equation that allowed all of that stuff to happen?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. It's always, From the get-go, I always want to have to say, and partly to remind myself, because I am a historian. I love history. I love thinking about what the evolving contexts of experience are, or our thoughts, or our culture, and how they change through time under various historical forces. So in some ways, I'm very grounded in that kind of evolution through time. But I think it's also really important to kind of say from the get-go that I believe there's something about these radical experiences, and possibly even consciousness itself, or certain expressions or forms of consciousness, that are radically ahistorical, that don't fit, that may even loop or refract or do something very peculiar in terms of historical time. And that's part of what makes these kinds of experiences, paranormal experiences, psychedelic experiences, weird, occult, or religious experiences, so interesting, is that even though you can kind of locate them in time and show this is what's happening at that period of history, and this is why they use this image, or this is why they use this story, because you can trace it to other things that are happening, at the same time, there's something else that's going on. So that's, I think, always there. But even if that is always there, it's still intersecting. It's like a lightning bolt that lands in a particular place at a particular time. And so inevitably, what happens when that lightning bolt lands is shaped by the context around it. I think in terms of that time, there were a few things worth isolating. One is that it is the kind of aftershock of the 60s, both in terms of people who had great expectations for transformation, political, cultural, spiritual, and who were in a number of different ways disappointed, and kind of left at the doorstop of history with like, here, kid, go at, good luck. The revolution didn't really happen. And that kind of story can be seen as just kind of a pessimistic story, like, oh, it was optimistic in the 60s and then it gets pessimistic in the 70s. And I don't really see it that way. I do see it as, obviously disappointing in some way, or deflating, surprising. But the way that a lot of people dealt with it is to just become creative in a different context. It's like, okay, that wasn't going to happen that way. Let's do something else. So let's move to a commune. Tons of communes in the early 70s. Let's go back to the land. Let's build a different framework for a possible society through different social networks, different ideas about how people could come together. Let's explore religion, or let's explore different mystical or spiritual experiences. I don't see that as just a kind of, some people will say, well, that's a sign of retreat, like politics failed, so let's go into the self. I don't really see it that way. I see it as more a intensification of the search, but in a different direction, with a kind of utopian hope that maybe this is the way that things can change. Terence McKenna is very much like that. Like, Terence McKenna was an angry, political young man at Berkeley, going to the anti-war protests. He wasn't exactly a leftist. He was more of an anarchist, but he definitely participated in that social movement. And in the early 70s, he has this line in True Hallucinations where he says, well, what's the most unlikely thing in our lives? DMT. Well, maybe DMT is the way to create revolution, or to, in the sense, not necessarily just changing a political structure, but of rewriting reality itself. And in retrospect, we can see that as kind of another hippie dream, another pipe dream, a particularly potent pipe dream. But it also has to be emphasized, because it's important to see the spiritual, cultural explorations that people devoted themselves to in the 70s as being a continuation of some of these desires and dreams for a different reality, or a better reality. So all these things are happening. And as a part of that, there's this publishing boom in occult and metaphysical literature. So everything's there. If you're a reader, like you and I are both, we've probably always been readers, and like, oh, that's weird. Oh, let's go down this rabbit hole. Like, let's go. If you were that kind of person, 1965, there was some stuff. But 1970, 1973.
Oh, yeah.
boom, there's just everything's available. Cheap paperback copies, whatever. It's all out there. Tantra, occultism, Aleister Crowley, Buddhism, Zen, everything. So there's this whole environment where people are picking and choosing or finding their path. And if these particular kind of intellectuals, they like it all, or they like a lot of it. They're interested in all sorts of dimensions of it. So they don't wind up with a particular worldview. Rather, they have a kind of postmodern or pluralist worldview where there's room for Taoism, there's room for anarchist politics, there's room for quantum physics, there's room for post-Freudian psychology, all of these different domains, anthropology, shamanism, all these different domains kind of have part of the story. So you have all these people trying to weave together all these different impressions. So that sense of navigating multiple possibilities is very much also about the 1970s, when American culture more generally, more broadly, outside of the counterculture or the post-counterculture, but just more generally was opening up to difference. The early 1970s is when America is constructed as a multicultural nation. That's when you had more and more moves towards inclusion. You had more and more discourses coming from sometimes radicalized people, but also sometimes more middle of the road zone. We're like, hey, we got to take Native Americans seriously. Hey, we got to take African Americans seriously. Hey, and some of them are going like, well, you got to take us seriously. But as a rapprochement, the more radical identity movements associated with Blacks or Native Americans or Hispanics, Chicanos, or lesbians or gays, like all of that identity stuff, it started to really change American society as a whole in the 1970s, where we kind of enter into this multicultural world for, better or, meaning like done better or worse in different expressions. It wasn't like a wonderful solution. It was sort of like a kind of compromise, but that's sort of the world we lived in. So it's a time of multiple options. Everything is spread out. There's lots of different things going on, and that multiplicity is also very much part of what's happening with these visions. Even though these are all white guys, all straight white guys, the way they navigate has to do with this increasing pluralism. So you have the post-60s, you have this multiplicity, you have this kind of spiritual search, which isn't necessarily strictly religious, but could also be in terms of consciousness. And then the final bit is sort of the role that technology and science start to play. That all of these guys were also really interested in science and technology. And in the 70s, science and technology start to move into these realms of altered states. No longer is an altered state a mystical vision. It is now an altered state, a phase of consciousness, something that you can identify, put on a chart, use biofeedback devices or EEG to track or trace. So you have the whole tracking yogis and Zen meditators. And that was happening in the 60s too, but it really explodes in the 70s. So there's this whole kind of middle zone between science on the one hand and religion on the other hand, where it's like we're honing in on consciousness. Like, what is consciousness? And even that term, consciousness, the way we use it now, is, if you look at it, it's a mix of different things. And one of the things is an object of science. We're going to study consciousness now the way we study the body, or we study cellular interactions or whatever, neurons. We also study consciousness. It's an object of science. That's the term that scientists use. But at the same time, of course, consciousness is expanded consciousness, cosmic consciousness. These terms, which occurred earlier in the century, but really only in the 20th century in the modern sense. You go back to William James and stuff to find our modern ideas of consciousness. But those ideas then come up again in the 70s area, where it's like psychology is now like a part of spirituality as well as a part of technology. So it's a very liminal zone that these guys are also navigating, and helps explain the kind of science fictional or technological quality to their visions, which is not normal in the history of religious experience. That's a newer flavor that has a lot to do with the 20th century that I think really kind of takes off in this period.
And you say that there's, I mean, also with all of this exploration, there is also a search for the self that keeps recurring. What sort of self is being searched for exactly?
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially with these guys, because I think they were all interested. I mean, there's another thing that unites them is that none of them were conventional seekers. Like if we think about the 70s seekers, like I want to find myself, or I want to find the real me. And then they try transcendental meditation, and then they try yoga, and then they try est, and they're searching all the time to find that goal. These guys weren't quite like that. They were in parallel in some ways. They were seeking something. But they also kind of took it in a more peculiar direction, partly because I think they were writers, partly because I think they were intellectuals, which you tend to complicate the history, the search for the self. And I think that they were also all in a way inspired by the idea that true self was something very peculiar, that it wasn't necessarily familiar. It wasn't like coming home. It wasn't like finding Jesus. It was like, oh, I'm actually an alien, or, oh, I'm actually a pattern of information processing in a cosmic computer. It had that psychedelic quality of the edge, that there's a part of psychedelics that can be very natural and peaceful and full of grace. You're in the field and the sun and the butterflies, and it's all one, and you're woven into this great raft of life. But there's another side of it that's cosmic and peculiar and meta and non-human and bizarre. And I think they all sort of drew, in a way, more from that side, so that the idea that the self you are seeking is not really yourself, or it's something else, that there's something other within. They were all drawn to the other in a certain way that I think a lot of seekers are drawn towards the self with a capital S. And that's true today. And as somebody who's interested in spirituality today, as well as then, it's something I see over and over again, that a lot of people who are on the path or a path are really in a way seeking the self as a home, or as a return, or as my true me. And tend to be more interested in where you seek the other, or the unknown, the incomprehensible, the multiple, the non-human. Not to deny your humanity, but that part of being human, and I think this is really true, part of being human is to be curious, and in some ways to be in relationship with the unknown or the mystery that isn't necessarily going to be very comforting and might even be terrifying sometimes. And that Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna both had this as a kind of aesthetic or a kind of temperament, and Dick was sort of naturally that way. Like he these things were happening to him not because he did take drugs, but he was more of a he was non-neurotypical, to not put a symptomatic term on it, which you can't really do. He was a very weird guy on a cognitive, almost certainly neurological level, and certainly once he got looped into all the drugs he did, and meaning more pharmaceuticals than psychedelics, although he did do psychedelics and they did influence him, and lots of speed, but also just all the pharmaceuticals he did. He was just this, you couldn't pin him down. You don't even know what's going on there. So he was kind of thrown into being an alien or being other, whether he wanted to or not. And you see this all in his fiction, and where there's sympathy for the android, and the human being is the one who's acting like a robot. And there's all these mixtures and blurrings of like what the human is. And he still was very invested in human and aspects of humanity, just like the other guys were. But there was another side that was very interested in like what happens at the edge, where we're no longer exactly human in the traditional sense. And so that, I think, is the way that all of these guys sort of had their own twist on the search for the self.
Yeah, it seems like Philip K. Dick, in a sense, was sort of like a mystic that was misplaced, in a wacky timeline. Like he wasn't quite. I mean, he was appreciated during his time, absolutely, and even more these days. But you know, it sort of was like a yoke. It was a responsibility for him to have all of these really, really intense experiences and still try to, I don't know, make something of that. There was no place, there's no, he couldn't go anywhere and talk to anybody about this stuff. There was no lineage that he came from to prepare him for his life experiences. So he always seemed a little off, like in any other culture, he would have been a seer or a shaman or a wise person, but he was just kind of a freak in the early 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
Yeah.
that's a big part of this here is that whole issue of not having a tradition or not
Yeah.
having a place in your society. And that's where, like, the way that it is important that they were all intellectuals, in the sense they were all readers. They thought a lot about history. They thought a lot about multiple fields, because being an intellectual already is a little bit alienating. But if you're an underground intellectual, you're not in a university, that's really weird, because there's just, why? What are you doing? And they all found their ways to kind of be that in, and still write books and have a certain kind of audience. And that's part of what's noble about it. And that's not even talking about the level that you're referring to here, which is that the kinds of experiences, and particularly the case of Dick, where it was sort of natural. He was like that from the get-go. In a way, you set like people like Dick loose in any given historical time, you learn a lot about what that time is about by the way that they take you, like, oh, this guy's a natural shaman, he's a natural dreamer, he's a natural artist, or he's crazy and we got to medicate him and get him into Porter Langley over here or whatever. So yeah, I think that was part, and then as part of this the search. And in a weird way, my book is also kind of about that lack of tradition, in the sense that while I wouldn't think that anyone is directly basing their experiences or worldviews on these guys, although some people do, in a way to remember them now at a point when so much is changing in terms of the story of, say, psychedelics, or the story of altered states, or the story of visionary experience, because these things are all back. They're all part of popular culture now, and part of elite, increasingly a part of expertise and corporations. We have a whole explosion of corporate psychedelics and stuff that almost sounds like a Philip K. Dick novel. That at this point, I find it really important to remember these guys, even though they're crazy, even though they had their own flaws and problems, because I think it's really important to affirm the very tentative tradition that we have as moderns being interested in these things. I mean, we too are like looking for traditions. So we go east, or we go to a guru, or we go to therapy or whatever. But in a way, we're still trying to make it up as we go along. And I think it's, from that perspective, really important to remember the people who came before, and recognize that, for better or worse, there are crazy uncles. There are lineage holders, and that includes, H.P. Lovecraft, and it includes, Aleister Crowley, who's like the bad uncle that you don't want to, like, oh God, Uncle Al, I don't want to, Jesus, he's so gross, but he's there, it's part of the story. And I'm more interested in kind of keeping that alive. Some people want to pick and choose and sort of filter out people that are too problematic. And I understand that, but I think it's more important to affirm everyone. And if I feel bad about anything in the book, it's just that the way it worked out, I just ended up talking about a bunch of white guys, and there's other stories to tell.
Sure.
That tradition is not just about white guys, although
Sure.
they do play a big role.
Absolutely. I think they all have an important role, to be sure. It seems like out of all three of those, Terence was the one that sort of had the most intent into calling forth his event, his life-changing event, which really happened to his brother. Whereas it seems with Philip and Robert, they sort of just kind of fell into it. Like Robert with the Sirius transmissions and Philip with 2374. Terence, they were kind of asking for it. They kind of set a place for it to happen, and it happened in a way that was very unexpected for them. Is there any way to explain what happened at La Chorrera in any sort of summarized manner for the listeners?
Yeah, I don't know about to summarize the whole thing, but
Sure.
I think you're right to point out that one of the things I was trying to emphasize or demonstrate, it's to some degree in all three cases, but it's most obvious in McKenna's, but in all three cases that they all kind of set themselves up a little bit. And this is arguably true of a lot of religious or mystical experiences. William James talked about this. William James was really interested in the phenomenon of conversion, which is a pretty interesting phenomenon. You're cruising along, you got your worldview, you got your personality, your life is you're doing whatever. Maybe things start to go bad, maybe they're even okay. And for whatever reason, somewhere along the way, you're like, boom, I'm born again. I'm seeing the light. I see, I believe in Jesus. I'm washed. I'm a new person. And, this is a big trope in Christianity. It's a big part of American religion. We had, these huge revivals earlier in the 19th and 18th century where there were mass conversions and people having these ecstatic experiences, rolling on the ground, frothing at the mouth, all the crazy shit you can imagine as part of a conversion experience. So, more sober people like William James would be like, what's going on there? How do we talk about it? And one of the things he talked about was the way that people who had these radical conversion experiences set themselves up. They just started to read this, or they have these encounters, and then there's certain symbols become kind of powerful, and you can kind of see the way, not necessarily consciously, but almost like unconsciously choosing to start to live in a new world where these things were true, and the pressure builds and builds until you start having dreams and synchronicities, and oh my God, the bumper sticker says something about Jesus just when I was thinking about Jesus, and they all start pointing till you have a break, and there's this kind of conversion moment. And in a way, I think all these guys had a certain version of that, where they were reading what they were reading. They were pushing their minds farther and farther out. They were, there's in general, certainly with psychedelics, a kind of apocalyptic energy that is there, meaning that there's some sense of some final revelation or some shift in history, or these big stories of revelation and transformation are really just kind of part of the phenomenology beyond a certain dosage level, at least for a lot of people. And so all of these things together in a way set up some of these experiences, which went in all cases far beyond a normal, even a big psychedelic trip. They were weirder than that, more long lasting. They went on for weeks or months, and they had all these synchronicities and all these things happening. So what they were ultimately about, I can't say, but I definitely think it's important to recognize the way in which all of the people involved were kind of co-creating these events, even though the events, ran away from them, or, took them in places they didn't expect or didn't even necessarily want to go to. And that loop there is very much part of the story and part of the process. But, in terms of what happens at La Chorrera, beyond that, there's these sort of X factors, that ahistorical lightning bolt, who was this teacher in their minds? They were channeling, essentially. I mean, they didn't use the word, but if you, and when I say channeling, I don't mean I necessarily believe that there's, nine-dimensional entities that are speaking through, blonde new age ladies in reality, but channeling as a psycho-spiritual phenomenon is totally real. It's sort of like being possessed, something takes over your mouth, you're using different language. It has a certain consistency. If you listen to different channeled teachers, there's a lot of similarities, even in the ways that language is used. And it's kind of odd, and they often doesn't quite make sense, or it's sort of blobbery, or whatever. And but it's part of a real phenomenon. And in a way, I think Terence and Dennis went through their own version of that, because they started to like create the plans for their own experiment through their kind of, it was like they're channeling a technology that had specific, blueprints. Part of them were conceptual, part of them were what they were actually supposed to do. But in a way, they were like some of these UFO people from the 50s who like received like the plans for how to build a weird time bending device. And so then they go and build it somewhere because they got the plans. It's not unlike that. They were getting channeled weird science that had this apocalyptic alchemical quality to it. And when they actually followed the protocols, it just boosted the whole thing farther than they well, maybe they expected to go even farther in some ways, but certainly went far enough, at least for me.
Yeah. And the one of the things I really love about that story too is that they go looking for some other completely different substance, and they just have such a hard time with it, and people in the party are turning on them, and there's infighting, and there's all kinds of shit happening, and so much heaviness in the air, and they finally get to this place where they can just breathe and relax, and then they stumble upon all of these huge mushrooms, and well, hey, let's take some of these,
Yeah.
and then that just leads into the rabbit hole that they wouldn't leave for weeks, or at least Dennis wouldn't leave for weeks.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of ironic, and it's actually interesting to think about today, because today, with the rise of global ayahuasca religion, or ayahuasca practice, whether or not, there's problems with it, and ayahuasca tourism, and how it's changing a lot of indigenous cultures, and often not in not a very good way. Although, they're part of the modern world too. And, it's a complicated situation. It is the case that, today, many psychedelic people who take entheogens very seriously take them in a more or less religious context, where there's an idea of some kind of continuity with indigenous practices or indigenous worldviews. And that's a really interesting process. There's a lot of people, I think, are doing that authentically. There's a lot of people who are doing it kind of dilutedly, but whatever. It's just part of what's happening. But Terence and Dennis went down there, and they were like, we just want to find this weird, substance. And they couldn't find it. And so then they end up taking all these psychedelics that don't have anything to do with the indigenous people around them. They didn't care about shamans. They weren't on the hunt for a shaman. That's really important. They were not like, we want to go down and find shamans and see what they have to say about these magical plants. They didn't care about that at all. They just wanted the stuff. And so now we can look at it, we can see that in a way they were off. Like, maybe what they should have been doing is looking for the local shaman and just try to get to know him and what he knows about plants, or what she knows about plants, and just take it more mellow and kind of build up. We can see that what they did in a way is a missed opportunity. And yet the irony of it, just the discovery of these mushrooms, which are all over the world, but which have appeared very infrequently in indigenous societies. And it's actually kind of an enigma. We don't really know when psilocybe or other, psychedelic mushrooms appeared in the regions in which they are now found. That's a big open question. So it may not have been the case that they were there for hundreds of years or thousands of years. But in any case, they're found all over the world, but there are very, very few indigenous societies that ever use them. So the psychedelic mushroom is already kind of a liminal character. It's not like, oh yeah, if there's psychedelics around, the local indigenous people will use them and incorporate them. That's true for datura. That's true, obviously, for ayahuasca, although how they figured that out is, a question in itself.
The plant spirits.
Right. But the mushrooms are like, oh, are we here? Are we not here? We always been here? Maybe not. So they have that alien quality, which, of course, McKenna picks up on and starts to imagine that they're actually from off-world, and that they've come here, and that they have their spirit, or the voice within them is really this kind of extraterrestrial, planet-hopping entity that wants to make a pact with us, to use us, to give us information about how to build starships. And I mean, it's so sci-fi. And I think maybe from a more grounded point of view, you could kind of say that, like, that kind of approach had to happen before people were able to go, maybe we should just listen to the indigenous people who've been doing this for a while, even if they've only been doing it for 100 years or so. I mean, that's something I just found out recently, that it was an anthropologist who studies ayahuasca in the Amazon. A lot of the native the indigenous groups in the Amazon who use ayahuasca have only been using it for 100 years, 150 years, 50 years.
Interesting.
Like it's spread, it's part of like modernity, the way that like the peyote religion outside of certain areas of northern Mexico and southern Texas, anywhere else, any of the, Native American church activity in the rest of the United States or whatever, that's all very modern. That happens in the late 19th century. And so there's something there too about we're kind of like, I think, trying to synthesize an indigenous impulse or many indigenous traditions and a kind of modern global, whatever this weird phase of history that we're in, and trying to kind of bring those together and weave them together. And Terence did his own version of that. But I think where we are now is in a way a healthier, more grounded situation where we pay more attention to indigenous knowledge without necessarily pretending that they know everything or that we can become indigenous, but rather making room for whatever they want to do, but also having more of an exchange and a conversation around plants and plant lore or whatever. So that's why I think psychedelic plants in particular and fungi are more, in a way, more important now, whereas McKenna and Wilson and to a degree Dick were LSD people. They were used, that's what or synthetic DMT. So I think there's been a shift in that way, and in that sense, these guys are from another generation.
What's your personal takeaway from what ended up happening to Dennis in the experiment? What do you think was going on?
Oh, to him?
Yeah. What do you think he tapped into?
What do I actually think he tapped into? This is just a riff. I am not, I suspect that there are states of consciousness, aspects of mind that have a profoundly unitive or collective dimension to them, in the sense that you are no longer my individual person, you are extended throughout space and time, and that's not just a story that the brain tells itself. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to suggest that there are aspects of consciousness. What is consciousness? We still don't know what consciousness is. And I don't really go into that in the book, but, I'm definitely, a Mysterian, some people would call me, in the sense that I think we don't know what it is. And that the way we don't know what it is we should be really open-minded about what it might be and how it might manifest.
Absolutely.
And so at the same time as which I recognize that I'm speculating or taking a grain with salt, that there's not really based in science, at least in a direct sense, that there does seem to be these transpersonal dimensions of consciousness that take the form of a kind of singular mind that's distributed throughout space and time, and that can have information in it. What's the status of that information? I don't know. Maybe, consciousness is sort of a something that's spread out in all these varying contexts, but that there's some point at which it connects, and some radical experiences of sublimity can touch this. But obviously, even if we grant that, there's a kind of spectrum of experiences that seem to be very healthy and ones that become increasingly psychopathological. So that's one of the key things about high weirdness. And I think one of the novelties about it as a work of scholarship is that I'm not trying to distinguish radically the real deal, actual spirituality, actual transpersonal states from psychosis, psychopathology, obsession, paranoia, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, it's not only a continuum, it's just like this weird weave And if you're lucky, you get a healthy one. But a lot of us don't get that. And if you look at the history of mysticism, even of like recognized Catholic Church approved mystics, some of them are just nutballs, super erotic or like self-lacerating. I mean, you know, it's crazy stuff because it's not it's not on the level of the person. So Dennis, a nerdy guy, had a nerd's mystic psychosis, meaning that it was kind of fragmented. He lost the ability to really communicate with people. You could ask him questions and maybe he was responding or not. And maybe there was a little telepathy in the picture, but maybe not. I mean, only Terence really heard it, and it's hard to say. So there's a lot of ambiguities around it, but he definitely lost the plot. He can't remember it, whatever. So it's not a conventional mystical experience where you remember what happened, or even if it has no content, it's sort of integrated. It wasn't integrated. And that, that offness might have been because of psychedelics. I don't think that they necessarily lead to highly integrated states a lot of the time. It might have been because of their youth or the weirdness, the fact their mom just died. There's a lot of psychological setups as well. And so in a way, I think it's a mix. And I think all of these guys, that was sort of the story, is like, it's a mix. There's something profound and genuine, very important in these experiences, but they are not entirely separable from pathology. And that's increasingly how I see religion in general, or spirituality in general. And it might sound kind of cynical or kind of like too skeptical when I say it baldly, and I don't mean it in that way, but it's still important to get the idea across, is that when many of us, maybe most of us, are engaging with religion, particularly as modern people who didn't necessarily, we could just be atheists or just ordinary consumers, just don't think about this stuff. But we have a call, we're searching, we're seeking, we're experimenting. We find things, then we find practices, we stick with them. We have experiences, we learn, that whole kind of world of self-making through religion in a broad sense. On some level, not the whole picture, but on some level, I kind of think we're working with our own pathology, not as something to just contain or heal, but actually as a kind of alchemical energy to dance with in order to produce something richer and more interesting and more valuable than what it would mean to just go to the pathology. So, for example, OCD. So like, I got OCD, whatever. Like I'm obsessive, I have repetitive patterns, whatever. OCD works really well with a lot of aspects of religion, the ritualism, the doing the same thing every day, So if you go and you start to discover a religious way of being when you have OCD and you start to do it, I'm not saying like, oh, that's just OCD, who cares? No. I'm saying the OCD is like a raw material, like a fuel that you're able to bring to sublimate in a way, in this sometimes more creative way. It can be not creative. People can be very lost in religious ritualism and deluded in it. But I think there's a creative way to be involved with that kind of ritual action. And I think a lot of spirituality, meditation, whatever you're doing, involves a sneaking suspicion that you're not quite open to yourself about, that you're a little bit more screwed up than you think you were, or sometimes that you're not screwed up, or you have explicit trauma or PTSD, and that what you're doing is a really good framework to deal with that stuff if you're lucky, or if you get the right stuff. It can go awry, it can go south, but it's better in a lot of ways than what the shrinks are giving you. It's way better than a pill, because at least you're wagering on meaning, that there's another way of being. And these guys, all the guys I'm writing about, are looking for those higher meanings. They're not doing it in a religious way, but they are doing it in a cosmic way, let's call it. And I think that that's a really important part and should be actually kind of acknowledged and celebrated. And that part of what's happening with psychedelics, and I think this is more and more clear in even the discourse around it, all the emphasis on healing. I'm less convinced that psychedelics heal, really. I have some issues with how that language is used as a kind of end state, but there's certainly a vehicle wherein we engage, become intimate with, dance with, and transform our own pathologies, both individual and cultural, the ones we inherit from our parents, our family lines, pathologies passed down from the beginning of time, as well as the cultural mess that we're in some ways. So, I mean, I think healing is a good direction. I get a little annoyed with this simplicity and patness and kind of solutionism of a lot of contemporary psychedelic discourse. But I do think that it is partly a reflection of our deepening recognition that these things can help us transmute our own nuttiness.
Yeah, I see that more, the healing part of the medicinal part more as an intention, as opposed to something that's inherently in the substance itself. Yeah. Just like many things.
I think that's really true.
What about the key? I got to ask you about the key. What do you the key?
Sure. Well, the key. So the key, of course, the story is that the Terence and Dennis had their grandfather had this key, and the key when they were kids was a really important symbol for them. It was something that was part of their like personal cosmologies, and that during this time when Terence suspected that his brother had transformed into a kind of transhuman wisdom being, that he would test him by asking him questions, by asking him math problems, he would poke him. And at one point he asked him to manifest the key. And then Dennis just opens his hand, and there's this key that Terence says looks like the key that their grandfather had. And so this is completely peculiar. So then immediately you're like, well, what do I do with this? Because this falls into that other category. And one of the things I talk about is how up to that point, even though there's already a lot of weird synchronicities and things that are implausible to say the least, you're still kind of like, okay, I can picture this. But when you come to the key, it's like a fork in the road, or a line in the sand is probably better. And some of us go, yeah, now things are getting really paranormal. Let's go. And then there's others of us who are like, that's too much. Like, I'm not going to go and go, oh, I'm sure this is accurately reported. I start to go, they're making it up. It was a joke, whatever. You start to become like skeptical. You're not willing to go there. So to answer your question, it's kind of a squirrely answer, but it is really how I feel about it, which is that I don't go to the place where I feel like it's my job or even my interest to judge what that was. Well, clearly the key manifested from the astral plane as a thought object or something. It's more that I become very much aware that I am now at that line in the sand moment, and that high weirdness, as opposed to the merely weird, that one of the features of high weirdness is that it will draw lines in the sand. So I'm more interested in that general character. The specifics, I think sometimes we get lost in. It's like you see that a lot with conspiracy theory. People get caught up with one particular synchronicity, or like, how come this happened at the same time that happened? And you obsess about it. And it's like, it's all about that one thing. Look, if this is true, it has to mean that X, Y, Z, Q, B, all these other things are true. And I don't think that's the right way to think about the paranormal. I'm thinking of a line that was in the wonderful paranormal series Hellier, that was a really interesting kind of like half real, half fictional YouTube series that dealt with real paranormal explorers, but they go and they unpack these things, and it's a very intelligent reflection on paranormality. But there's one character they meet in it who warns them about that they're going down the rabbit hole. And he's like, and he's old hand at the paranormal research. And he's really like, you got to watch it, man. You really got to watch it, because at the end of the day, what these things mean may be nothing more than the fact that these kinds of things happen to people. That's it. That's as far as you go. All you're saying is that really, really weird things happen to people. That's it. You can't go anything beyond that. Oh, well, that means that there's a, what are you doing? It's like, just like conspiracy theory. Like, people want to get to the, oh, now I know, oh, the COVID is a plant and they're using it because they want to back. So, okay, now I got my story. And I think that's frankly dumb. I think that the mystery of existence is asking us to take on a much higher level of ambiguity and not knowing, and seeing how far we can go up to the mystery. As closer we get, the less and less we know. And our instinct is to hold on to something. And so I think Terence's attitude is good. It's like, something like that happened. How did it happen? Dennis doesn't remember. What can we say? And then the only other layer I can add to it, and that I do add to it in the book, is that they were big Lovecraft fans, and Lovecraft clearly structured their psychedelic imaginations, their visionary imaginations, as it has for many of us, including myself.
Yeah.
And that the tale of the Silver Key is this Lovecraft story that really relates to these dream realms and which doesn't mean that there wasn't a physical key. I'm not going to say that. But it does mean that the echo, that when we're involved in these kinds of high weirdness stories, and this is something my PhD advisor, Jeff Kripal, really emphasizes, is that when we're involved in those stories, we are involved in stories. And those stories go back, they echo in different directions, and we become kind of nexuses of narratives that are bigger than us, that are longer than us, that have been going on longer than us. And that's part of what we're navigating when we're navigating high weirdness, is that suddenly stories take on a life of their own, or we see the way that they have taken on a life of their own, and we have to kind of find our way through with a mixture of credulity and skepticism, usually, and not to kind of get completely taken over by a story, which is what happens when you have, again, conspiracy theory is the obvious example. You have somebody who's decided on their pet conspiracy, even though once you start thinking about conspiracy theory, it's like, well, what makes this one more true than that one? And if that one's true, and this one's true, and this one's true, and that one's true, then none of them are true, because it shows that the world of the conspiratorial forces is, like everything else in the world, full of multiple agendas, and they're fighting each other all the time, and they're trying to hoodwink each other and get other people to believe stuff. Oh, wait, that's just what reality is. So why would I believe the one story? Enough said on the conspiracy rant. But I think the health is to stay with the phenomenon, with the weirdness, with the mystery, with the not knowing. See how far you can go, but you got to be honest with what you know. You got to be, and you have to be willing to take a really high, bitter, strange shot of ambiguity and hold it down. Like, I don't know what's going on, and I'm going to go move forward in my life. And that's, in a way, one of the things that I'm most interested in, this story of all these guys, because they were all kind of skeptics, kind of believers. They throw themselves out there, but they were also like a step back, and they were all cycling it through writing, which is a great medium to play with these multiple possibilities.
I think that's a fantastic place to draw this particular conversation to a close. Jesus Christ, there's so much to tackle in this book. I feel like we've just dipped our toe into it.
Yeah, it's a monster. I mean, it's not for everyone, but for the people for whom it is something, they're going to be able to, enjoy it for a while.
I was born in 66, a year before you. Yeah. So a lot of that stuff was very precious to me, and a lot of it I didn't get to, but like
Excellent. Thanks so
High
much,
Weirdness
Chris.
by Mail, Semiotext, a Muck Journal, all of that stuff. John Lilly, who hardly ever gets talked about. Maybe at some point we just need to have another part to this. If you're
Yeah, actually, Lily was going to be a whole section.
Oh, cool.
But everything else was expanding so much, so I just kind of shoehorned him into the place that he gets like 5 pages or something like that.
Yeah.
And same thing with Leary. I mean, Leary's whole experiences at Vacaville, it all fits in. You could tell a much longer version of that, but it's already long enough. I think you'll agree.
I think it was perfect. I never found myself going, my fucking God, how long is this going to drag on?
Well, that's nice to hear.
Yeah, I wanted more. Okay, well, can you tell our listeners not only where they can get your book, but where they can find you?
Oh yeah, sure. So the book's out wherever, Amazon, blah blah blah. I recorded the audiobook myself, and that came out just a couple months ago, and people really like that. I think in some ways it's if you find the scholarship stuff a little bit arcane and difficult to read, the audiobook is better because I'm a good reader, and I kind of sort of, you can tell by my voice intonation, like what, because I know what I mean. So It's like, it's pretty communicative, and I know a number of people who much prefer it. So I'm really happy that I recorded it myself. And then the other thing that I've just started to do that's new is I've started to use the platform Substack to put out my own kind of online blog, journal called The Burning Shore. And that's what I'm doing now. And that really explores California consciousness, because in a way, this has also been a whole conversation about California, even though we didn't mention it. And so I'm trying to start doing like an online publishing platform that I'm doing. And it's like, free subscription. I'm trying to get people to pay eventually. So hopefully I can make some money that way so I can keep writing independently. But at the moment, I'm just super enjoying being able to just do exactly what I want in a nice little short things, as opposed to a very long book. So
for sure.
So that's exciting. The Burning Shore.
And it's just theburningshore.com. It's
well, actually, the whole URL is, I think it's Substack. Let me find the. It's actually Erik Davis Substack.com. But I say The Burning Shore because usually you can just do a search. I never know whether people prefer the actual URL or just the search terms that they're best going to use.
Well,
it's so confusing out there.
It is. It's scary.
Yeah.
And sexy.
Yeah.
I will put all of these links in the episode notes. So, Erik.
Great.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and let's think of a reason to do it again sometime in the near future. What a fantastic show. But Jesus Christ, I had so many more questions. We barely got into Terence, much less Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick. So I'm hoping that I can convince Erik to come back and finish out that long question list that I had. His book is very, very thick, but I never found myself getting bored in the least throughout the whole of it. And if any of you are around my age, we'll say mid-50s-ish, I think a lot of this stuff, especially if you were involved in the counterculture around that time and purchased the book High Weirdness by mail from the Church of the Subgenius, or Semiotext, watched Night Flight, any of that kind of stuff, I think you will really appreciate the description of the cultural context that all of this stuff took place in, because you'll recognize the trappings. And it really does it justice, for sure. It's just brilliant. You really should, if not read it, listen to the audiobook, which is what I did. So I got to hear Erik's imitation of Terence McKenna, which is really good. But supposedly he had to tone it down a little bit because the person that was putting out the audiobook, or the company that was putting out the audiobook, thought that was just a bit much. So I want to hear I should have asked him to do it on the show, but I totally forgot. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did and would like to contribute and like to see more of this show, I would definitely love to put out more episodes per month. You can contribute in a few ways. You can go to my Patreon page, www.patreon.com/themeltpodcast. And there are many different ways that you can contribute, many different levels. for as low as $1, which you will totally not miss. And I'm sure you spend much more than $1 on stuff that you regret afterwards every week, if not every day. On up, whatever you think it's worth. And if you don't have the finances to contribute, you can share this around. You can send links to your friends. You can post it on whatever social media site you find yourself on the majority of the time, or just word of mouth. Any of that and all of that is very, very helpful and helps this podcast to get out to more people. And finally, you can, if you do subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, so on and so forth, you could leave me a good review, or you can rate me in a very limited and rudimentary 5-star rating system. All of these things help. And another way you can help us to contribute content. And by that, I mean, if you have stories that you would like to share that you think would fall into the wide array of topics that I cover here on The Melt, I would love to hear them and possibly include them on a future show that fits in somewhat with the subject that's being discussed with the guest. So if you would like to do that, you can send those to themeltpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. And if you want to give me any feedback, that can also be at themeltpodcast@gmail.com. That includes guest recommendations. So thank you all so much. Great shows coming up. This is just the first out of 3 fantastic interviews that I all did in the same week, but they will be unrolling every 2 weeks as it is. But keep tuned. You will not be disappointed. Thank you so much, guys. And until next time, take care.